Yeah, we're recording. Oh, I actually do need to.
At least you didn't do it this time. Tomorrow.
3 things in the speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, why we're better for consumers. Thirdly, why we're better for farmers. So on setup, what do you think this rise off looks like? I think it looks like having massive or national scale supermarkets. I think it looks like Coles and Woolworths, Aldi and IGA. I know it's likely these exist in tiers, like Coles and Woolworths being like the larger tier. Note, we think that because there already exists very large supermarkets in the status quo, we think we are supporting a rise that has already happened, and we think this debate largely exists retrospectively, and we want to show that this rise was good. Note what we think the comparative is. We think it probably looks like smaller and location-specific supermarkets and a lot more farmer markets. Okay, on to why we're better for consumers. First on framing. Note we think consumers are the most important stakeholder just because there are so many of them, and secondly, they literally require food to survive. Okay, 3 things in the speech, in this point. Firstly, on why it's cheaper. I think firstly, just large supermarkets are able to operate at economies of scale. That's because they can store things in in massive warehouses. They can transport things in bulk. Note this means there is a smaller cost to these large supermarkets. They're able to relay smaller costs onto consumers. Secondly, that these big chains are able to buy in bulk. That means you're able to buy 50,000 cans of Coke versus 5,000. That note, at the point at which you're buying more in bulk, this is often to be cheaper and getting better deals, just because obviously a seller wants more profit, right? Not necessarily just a percentage of profit. So they're more likely to get a better deal if you do buy in bulk, so it's going to be cheaper. Thirdly, is that they have massive negotiating power. Just note the size of conglomerate suppliers of products that go into supermarkets. This looks like conglomerates such as Lilydale Chickens, Heinz, and Sanitarium. I think you need massive amounts of economic power to actually ever be able to negotiate with these conglomerate farmers. I think at the point at which you are a small farmers market, you're probably never going to be big or important enough to these massive conglomerates to ever get a beneficial deal. Compare that to with Coles or Woolworths, who are able to because they probably take just so many of these products. Fourthly, by the nature of competition. I think, obviously, they compete with other supermarket chains, right? That means they lower costs, but specifically, I think because they exist on a national level, they are competing nationally versus on location-specific level, where you're only ever competing with local supermarkets or local farmers markets. I think specifically though, because of the nature of competition, you're actually able, because of large supermarkets, these are able to be in poorer and regional areas. Why is this so good? This is because large supermarket chains are able to subsidize stores in low SES areas. Firstly, why are they happy to operate stores in low SES areas which may run at a loss? This is because they obviously just want to buy the land, right, at the point at which that land is probably going to be valuable within 30 and 40 years. Note these companies have very good long-term incentives. So we think, and they also just have the capital to buy these stores. And note, at the point at which Coles doesn't buy it, Woolworths obviously will. This looks like buying in places like Campbelltown and Logan. I think, so you get more stores, and these stores are going to be cheaper. Why is this so important? I think just at the point at which you are impacting literally every person who has to buy food. But secondly, that you are just able to run stores in low SES areas. I think the comparative is probably you get a lot less who just don't want to operate in these areas because they're probably going to run at a loss. Secondly, in this point, why goods and services are going a higher quality under our side. I think firstly, just because these large supermarket chains are able to optimize quality control. Why is this? That's just because they receive a lot more stock. They're also able to source their stock from more suppliers. That means it's much easier for them to throw out stock. I think that means that you are just probably getting a lot less stock that is, for example, bad to consume, etc. And you have higher quality standards. Secondly, they're just able to implement more services. What does this look like? It looks like being able to have personal shoppers for people who can't shop by themselves. It looks like having home delivery for people who, for example, like have to work all day, they don't have the time to go to the shops. It looks like having meal plans and cooking catalogs for people who don't know. It also looks like having home insurance and phone plans for people as well. Thirdly though, is that you just give consumers more choice when they are shopping in your stores. This is because obviously they're able to source from more widely, more nationally. That means you have a larger number of brands available. And most importantly also, is you probably just lead the market for vegan products, vegetarian products, gluten-free products, halal products, etc. Why is this? I think that's firstly, you're just able to source from a more variety of brands than like the local farmers market. That means first of all, you're more likely to have these specific things. But even if there exist companies that also sell like vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free products, Coles and like Woolworths are able to sell these for cheaper for the reason that firstly, these are relatively new markets. That means that they can like lower prices, run at that, and like use profits from other areas to subsidize this to block out any new people coming into this market because it is a growing market. But also, just they have all of the reasons I gave you about why they're going to give these things for cheaper anyway. I think that's really important at the point at which someone literally believes they have to eat like halal food or they go to hell. It literally allows them to shop. Okay, why do we think they're also more accountable on their outside? Firstly, just note the point that they have huge public visibility at the point at which, first of all, they have like lots of ad campaigns. Obviously, a majority of people probably just do shop at Coles and Woolworths, and they obviously do care about their image at the point at which they want people to shop at them, they want people to like them. I think also, second, and this just means, right, they have to care about their image, they're much more likely to make decisions which make people like them. Secondly though, I think with the rise, due to the rise of, I think they are much more open and much more visible on the outside at the point at which they're larger compared to opposition, which just has smaller ones. I think that means, first of all, they're just much easier to criticize, right? It's really easy to bring up the cost of products at Woolworths with friends if like all of your friends also shop at Woolworths versus if you go to like individual farmers market. Also much easier just to have national and like news, media debates about it because it's probably the same for a very large region of these prices. But thirdly, I think the government just has a massive incentive to regulate this industry because note the impact that like buying at these stores has to people. At the point at which there is price gouging, as we've literally just seen, there are going to be massive public backlashes, there's going to be massive public inquiries, there's going to be massive amounts of regulation. I think that just like looks at the amount of tension it's gotten so far. I think it looks like the response to like the Four Corners investigation, etc., was to make sure that there has been actual change and that Woolworths and Coles have lowered their prices. But secondly, why we're also better for farmers. I think firstly, just note that farmers have a lot of bargaining power in the status quo. What does this look like? I think firstly, they're literally just like the nationals in politics. I think the nationals have an enormous amount of power at the point in which they literally represent like some agrarianism. And secondly, I think farmers just have an incredible ability to lobby. That's because society depends on their products, right? Society cannot function without them. So farmers' protests are incredibly effective. Look at how effective farmers' protests are in France, in the Netherlands, etc. They're able to force government change if they do feel like they are being hard done by. But also, just note that they are the most subsidized economy for a reason, right? Because a government cares about making sure they are not dependent on other countries for food. They're always going to make sure farmers can operate. Secondly, it's just easier for these farmers to contract and deal. Look, just to compare Woolworths versus farmers market. Thirdly, it's more consistent demand at the point at which maybe the farmers market won't take you this year. So proud to propose.
I thank first Affirmative for those kind remarks and invite first Negative up when they're ready. Here. Test this. There we go. Start it again. Stand up. Yes, please. Yeah.
IG speculation is about to be crazy.
a lot of content about how all these really big duopolies are going to be passing on, they're going to make these massive profits, and they're going to pass this profit on to the consumer. But they give us no mechanisms as to why these big conglomerations are actually going to pass this profit on. We think that the biggest, the problem with smaller grocers in the status quo is not that they suck in and of themselves, but it's that they suck in comparison to these massive duopolies which have a huge control over the market, and therefore they have no opportunity to thrive. Okay, firstly, a bit of clarification as to a bit of setup, because we think that was very true or charitable, and then onto a bit of 2 points, hopefully. Firstly on the cost, and secondly on access to food. Okay, going into the setup and then integrating a bit of a bundle into that. What we think we actually see in these duopolies is we see very, very little competition, because we have these two massive supermarkets, Coles and Woolies, which may compete with each other, but this is not a remotely healthy amount of competition. We also don't think that the rise of these massive supermarket chains really includes things like IGAs and stuff, because they are locally owned. We think that these are exist separately to these large supermarket chains. That's not really something they can talk about. We also think that these big supermarkets are so prevalent, are so impactful, because they have they have the consumer's perception in a chokehold. We think that it's a circular feedback loop in which the consumer perceives these stores as the only option, therefore they're the only ones that they're going to go to, because they have been around for so long. So the consumer doesn't really see anything else, they just perceive them as really good, so therefore they end up being really good. And we think that this is kind of why we got this material from the Affirmative team about how they care about the image and they make decisions to make people like them. But we think that this has been done. They are dominant. They don't really need to care about their image anymore. They know that people are only going to shop with them because either they are the only option or they are the most convenient option, and therefore they can do whatever the fuck they want to the consumer, because that's all they're going to go to. They don't think of anything else. So on and so forth. Yeah, we also think that this is the reason they are so prevalent is because they have a large amount of stores. Yeah, that's the access point again. What we think we actually see is we see a lot of smaller chains, such as these IGA chains, such as but also things like local butchers, local markets, and stuff like that. And we think that we see this comparatively because there is only a certain amount of retail space. We don't see them under the status quo because this retail space is taken up by these big corporations. We think that these new stores are going to come in, fill this vacuum, and we think this is because of the people who are going to be running these small grocery chains are people like entrepreneurs who will see demand in the absence of these big chains, and therefore will see an opportunity to make money because people do need to buy food. They will fill this gap. But we also see people who are really passionate about what they do, people who've passed on this butchery chain through generations and stuff. People do actually enjoy what they do. There will be people to fill these gaps. And this is why we get actually stable local businesses, because there will be these people, there will be gaps filled in the absence of Colesworth to fill these retail spaces. Okay, why would people actually go to these local stores in the absence of Coles and Woolies? The reason people go to Coles and Woolies right now is because they are convenient, because they perceive them to be really good. But what we get instead is people who the consumer likes homegrown things. That's why we see those, the Harris Farm Markets chains. It is a chain, but it's perceived as homegrown, so people like to go to it, even though it is still a form of a chain, because they think, oh, I'm supporting local businesses. This is really good for me. It's a bit of virtue signaling or whatever. But we also think that people like to engage with their local community. That's why people donate to things. That's why people go down and help at the sausage sizzle or something like that. People like to, at the very least, think that they're being good, engaging in a community nicely. But also people like to shop for things which are higher quality, organic, fresh, or whatever. They like these buzzwords. They're going to go to places which have been perpetuated to be to have these properties and stuff. So they're going to go buy stuff from these local butchers. Right. Okay, onto a bit of material on why we get better costs. Okay, so right now, what we see with these large Coles and Woolies is we see them price gouging. We think that this is pretty obvious, but I'll explain it anyway. We think this is because there is little competition. We think that because therefore no matter the price, people are going to go to these stores. Therefore, they know they can up these prices. They know that people probably won't go anywhere else. They can up them however the fuck they want. want. Sorry. And we think this was also conceded by the Affirmative team. But what we think, they gave us stuff about how they probably won't, very contradictory, yeah, whatever. We don't think, they will not be regulating these prices because, they don't. The government will not regulate this price gouging because, yeah, they just straight up don't. We think that these stores donate to political organizations and stuff. So therefore, there is kind of this weird mutually beneficial thing going on. They're probably not going to actually regulate them. But what we think we see instead is we see a lot more room for competition because right now, Coles and Woolies can expand really easily. We think the comparative is when they are not so present, we think that these local stores can either existing local people can expand easily, or new stores can fill these gaps. And with these greater sense, more options going on, people will shop around because people do shop around. We see this in under the status quo. We see this in how maybe if you want to buy a bit of a tin of tuna or something for your groceries, you're going to go check both the Coles and Woolies websites and see, oh, who's got it on special this week? I'll go to that store. But we think what we get when we have more options, people will shop around much greater. They will have much better opportunity to cheaper prices, and therefore these stores are going to be much more motivated to lower these prices, simply because they know that they have to for people to be able to come and shop for them. We think these stores can also cater to the pricing of their local area. Yeah, so we see this being really impactful in rural areas where local stores have been outcompeted by really predatory chains like Coles and Woolies, and which is justified by higher costs are justified by things like travel costs and stuff. We think that if this is local, these travel costs are going to go down, but we also think that even if this results in a bit less diversification, this is fine because yeah. All right. On to how this cost impacts farmers. All right. If corporations are the only ones, or perceived as the only ones these farmers can sell to, these corporations can much more easily fuck these farmers over. Sorry. This is pretty intuitive, but this is because the farmer has no choice. They have to sell their product in order to survive. They're going to sell it to whatever bidder is presented to them because there is really no other option. But what we think is what we can get instead is they think when they have lots more options, when they have all these local grocers, these farmers can shop around. They will shop around again, similar to the consumer. They will shop around. They want the best value for money, and we think that this will also stop local farmers competing with international things coming in and they don't have to import things from countries that are willing to be paid less. We think this is just really good for the environment, but also less damaging to local farmers. We think this is really important because farmers are really important for the economy. They think they're probably going to be happy when they have a business to run properly, and it's also just better to eat local because transport emission bad, food waste bad, Coles and Woolies bad. Thank you.
Thank you to first negative for those 5 remarks. Second affirmative to continue the affirmative case whenever you're ready.
The dog is scratched the ball. Dog is throwing it out. That's anyway. The single most important stakeholder in this debate is consumers. This debate is about making sure that consumers who are often shopping to put food on the table can afford to put food on the table and can meet their demands in a timely and efficient and cheap manner, and that is the side affirmative has proven and has not been engaged with by side negative. The first thing I want to start with here is their counterfactual and the idea of will these gaps in the market be filled absent the rise of these big chains. Their alternative to this is your local butchers, your local the vegetable market, etc. Family businesses passed down the generation. The problem here is firstly, those things already exist in large communities in large parts around Australia. And all the reasons why they exist are identified by first affirmative. Because sometimes people want an organic approach, they want to feel like they're doing good, they want to connect to a family business or something like that. So to the extent those things are valuable, they already exist in status quo and provide that level of choice and opportunity for individual consumers. But that also presents a level of competition, Coles and Woolies as well, if those local butchers are so much better than what exists already, which means you do have that bit of competition already. So the second thing I note here is that what characterises those local vegetable markets and butchers is a higher expense. They cost more money to buy your steaks and your sausages and vegetables from there because they are one tiny corner store who has to pay a significant amount of rent because they're often on high cost rental buildings, they're on public roads, etc., so people can access them, but also don't have massive warehouse space. They don't have massive negotiating power. They don't buy in bulk. They don't have to make contracts with Pepsi or Coke or with Lilydale or mass farming corporations. All that means that those that if the alternative were to exist and could fill the market, it would massively drive up the prices for those individuals. And note here, competition can't work as effectively with those groups, because even if you believe their best case, you can have a sufficient number of butchers to replace the amount of butchers of Coles or whatever. Each individual one of those butchers has to charge higher prices, because it can't like cross-subsidize with other products. It can't cross-subsidize with having a shared warehouse space or shared management staff. It has to duplicate all its other costs, which means the floor of that competition, while competitive, still is much higher than the floor of that competition that happens in Coles and Woolworths. So we think we get a worse deal off on their side for consumers with their alternative. The second thing to note here is that when those sort of alternatives were big and dominant, population centres were different. It was a dispersed population, it was a far smaller population where it made more sense because you didn't want to have food wastage or stock going unspent. People just would not buy that now. We're talking here about massively urbanised city centres that do require, that there's just too many people, the local corner shop butcher, who properly service effectively without massively increasing their prices, because the demand was so much more than they could meet and they wouldn't be able to get that supply. So we think in that point there, the scale aspect actually makes it massively better for them. The last thing I note here is that like we get this claim from First Home, it's much easier to shop around on their side, and that is preferable. One, you have to have capacity. People are incredibly time poor these days. People, like often most families, both parents work. We have kids who are going to school, people are working long hours. The capacity to shop around and research which of the 4 supermarkets or the 27 local butchers in your area selling tuna for the smallest amount of price is incredibly time consuming. People are unlikely to be able to have access to do that. But now they can just know that Coles and Woolworths will have the cheapest tuna, I'll just go there and get it with everything else. But additionally, if the corner store or the butcher has the cheapest meat, but the vegetable store 4 blocks away has the cheapest vegetables, that makes it harder for you to go across both, where you just go to Coles and get them all for the cheapest price in one go. But secondly, I'd also ask if these multiple stores actually exist to be able to have that competition in the first place, because their costs are so much higher to operate, they're unlikely to come about. Thirdly, what if you need smaller things? What if you need vegan sausages? What if you need halal sausages? What if you need gluten-free food? Those things are not stocked by small local butchers because they cost so much money and there is so little demand for it. We explained to you at first that Woolies and Coles are able to make those products relatively cheaper because they can cross-subsidize the cost of normal meat to subsidize the not meat in order to make people be able to access them. The third thing I note here is that in terms of rural areas, there's literally no change there, because the structural barriers that prevent big changes just in rural areas that mean smaller groups, smaller local businesses succeed, stay the same on both sides here, so we don't need a massive change there. So that I think proves that they won't actually fill the gap on their side. Let's then secondly talk about price, which is their second biggest push here. Firstly, the claim you give right from the start of First Home is the price drop won't be, the price savings won't be passed on to consumers overall. Here's got reasons why it will be. Firstly, it's just competition, because Woolworths knows that if they don't pass the price drop, Coles will, and it's a race to the bottom of who's likely going to pull the trigger furthest and get that first mover advantage. There's always going to be an incentive for them to continue to drop their prices lower. Secondly, they buy lots of stock. They buy a shit ton of stock to store their supermarkets, which means it's them to sell it, because they have to drop the price to get it out of the door, because the more stock takes up more warehouse prices, if it goes off, it costs money to get rid of, etc. So you want to get that stock out of the door quickly, which means you're more likely to drop the prices to get it going further. But thirdly, it looks really, really bad if they don't. When they post massive quarterly profits and then people are struggling to pay the till, that's when they get criticised. That's when they have image issues. That's when they go into crisis mode. That's when the CEO of Woolworths is forced to resign because of a terrible interview on 4 Corners. So we can concede, I think, without losing this debate, that Woolworths and Coles have had a bad couple of years, but they've done that and that's now been corrected because of the public pressure on them to operate. You don't get that for the reasons that Matt explains at first as to why there's not much attention given to smaller one-off companies, etc. So they're more than likely to pass on the costs. And even if Woolworths is not passing on all of the cost savings in existence, still making lots of profit, you have to ask yourself the question, panel, is it still cheaper than what it would be in the alternative? And we would claim that it is. So we're okay with a little bit of extra profit for these companies, because overall the prices, for all the reasons we talked about first and second, are still significantly lower than they would be on the alternative, and that is the win for us. The second thing I know on competition, they said that Aldi and IGA don't have competition. They actively do. Yes, they are locally owned in the community. They provide local level competition. Woolworths sets generalised national pricing, but also modifies its pricing across different sales, especially in local areas. So like Aldi's and IGAs, etc., do provide a degree of local competition as they are effective in this market. And also, they're national brands. They're also pretty big, and they're also like pretty big supermarkets too. There's a huge jump between the local butcher and IGA or Aldi overall. In terms of consumer perception, I would say that it is the huge critique of Coles and Woolworths means it is consumer pressure. They don't just sit back and be like, well, I guess it's Coles and Woolworths, it must look good. No, there is pressure on people to do campaigns, and people do just like them. The next thing I note on price here is they don't care about the ongoing image because they're the only ones there. I would say it looks really, really bad if you're the subject of ongoing political inquiries, if the government is constantly knocking at your door, if lawyers are coming at your door, when a current affair is doing exposés on you, which most of your target market watches. I think at that point then you don't want the negative repercussions of being on that government interference, etc., because it does make yourself look bad. But also, I think the government has a lot of slow down. The problem here is the government controls access for foreign supermarket chains to enter the Australian market and can block the equivalent of the American supermarket, the British supermarket, coming into Australia. So the Coles and Woolies don't want to piss off the government so much so the government says, okay, let's let in another big supermarket chain that comes in with $1 billion of US profit and immediately becomes more competition for them. So the more they piss off the government via electoral incentives, the more risk there is to their ongoing profits and ongoing stability as a company, and that also means regulation is effective. It's a threat of it. It's other companies coming in and these government inquiries overall. Let's then talk about farmers next of all. Who are farmers? I think the problem here is don't believe the rhetoric about them being small or vulnerable Aussie battlers that we should care about. We're talking here about Lilydale. We're talking here about mass, big global corporations. We're talking about Chinese Communist Party owned large farm parts of own most of the Northern Territory's farmland. These are the companies, corporations we're talking about here. Hobby farmers are not the ones that are supplying massive supermarket chains. They're the ones that are struggling because they're supplying small butchers and local businesses that cannot keep up with the demand. All the reasons we tell you at first go unresponded to about why the constant demand and simplicity of contracts is actually a massive win for farmers. But also, they do have lots of competition. Farmers do have lots of competition who they can sell their products to. Because Australia's beef and lamb export industry is huge. Thank you, Tim Jackson, for the spec knowledge. All of these groups here and they provide competition to Coles and Woolworths, so there is a degree of bargaining power here, but also we tell you all the reasons at first as to why farmers are actually a super important and super beneficial group. The last thing I note here is that I'm out of time, but it's really important, and that is because Woolworths is so big and it competes on its public image. It funds programs like the Woolworths Cricket Blast and does really good things that are healthy for the community, provide good outcomes for kids. Coles puts school equipment in schools, etc. And it can do that because it has lots of spare money with being a big corporation, and it trades on its ethical nature because it provides apples to children. That's why we get better community benefits, better for farmers, better for consumers. We win the debate.
Thank you to Second Affirmative, especially for mentioning cricket, and I welcome Second Negative whenever you're ready. Here. Yeah.
I am incredibly perplexed by this team's case because they come up here and tell us that these profit margins are being passed on to lower costs. They come up here and tell us that things are great, but when an average family, when an average single mom walks into Coles and Woolworths now, life has never been harder. All of the prices are far more increased because this team gives you poor mechanization about why increased profit margins are then passed on to the consumers and why corporations making so much money under the status quo have an incentive to pass these on. Because note that they neglect completely that these businesses have shareholders, these businesses have other equity incentives, and that's why they try to increase profit, but no profit isn't going back into the hands of the consumers. That just means they have an incentive to keep prices high to ensure those profit margins are big and growing year on year. That is why you can no longer feed your family at Coles for $10 like you could 20 years ago, despite the fact that Coles is making record profit margins. This team would have some sort of case if the profit margins were incredibly thin as prices were high, but that is simply not the case. Prices are incredibly high and profit margins are soaring because these corporations have unique, incredibly perverse incentives to do so. Okay, first thing I'm going to talk about characterization. Secondly, I'm going to talk about consumers and a little bit on government lobbying and farmers at the end here. Okay, firstly on characterization about the market gap and how that works. Because Rob tries to tell you that these butchers and these types of small businesses already exist in their world, but they completely neglect the analysis we gave you at first, which is that these small businesses are on the fringes, they are struggling. And the reason that they are struggling is because of these predatory corporations that are able to just be defaulted to by retailer spaces that sign the contracts with Coles and Woolworths because they have this really dumb perception that they are the only safe investment. But the reason they are perceived as the only safe investment is completely misfounded. I think retrospectively, had these businesses had the opportunity to take up these spaces, there would have been significantly more confidence. So there would have been more retailer space and more willingness for places like Westfield and stuff like that to sign contracts with more local butchers and other smaller shopping centres to open up, to be open to opening smaller markets and other analogous businesses here. So I think that ultimately we on the comparative just want more of these small businesses. Even if you have them a little bit in their world, we want them to expand grind by tenfold. We believe it would have been better if they had been like tenfold more in like retrospectively. Okay, then everyone tries to tell you that there are higher expenses to these businesses. I think firstly, people do shop around, like Rob tells you that they are time poor, but I think that given that cost is the biggest priority for families and stuff like that, if costs are generally lower, I think people will be willing to sacrifice a little bit more time and spend a little bit more time on the weekend going shopping, because know that they are still time poor symmetrically in their world as well. But secondly, small businesses can buy in bulk. Like, what the fuck is this team talking about? Like, a local butcher can still have agency over the suppliers that they go to. Like, they can go to a local farmer. A local farmer is probably still like willing to like sell them a bulk load of sugarcane. Like, these businesses are still capable of doing that. Bulk buying is not completely exclusive to these massive corporate conglomerates that they talk about. Businesses are still capable of calculating the bulk purchase cost and passing that on the smaller scale that they want to talk about. But secondly, I also think it's just important to note that these types of small businesses have things like lower labor costs. They probably have to employ less staff and stuff like that. They're probably paying less rent because they have smaller spaces, but they can still provide all the food that people need. They can still store a lot of food. Like, it's not that hard to store a significant amount of meat in a butcher's, for example, and then just replenish that. And I think that gets to the extra benefit that we have businesses in our world that do things like waste far less food, because they can see to the fact that these businesses just bulk buy food to the point where it just becomes stupid. And I think in their world, you waste millions and millions of tons of food that could otherwise actually have been passed on to the community, and farmers' work going to waste to no benefit. I also think that just ultimately, the less caring about profit margins and shareholders just means these small businesses have an incentive to run at only a small profit margin. Because note that the wages of the people in these small businesses will be incorporated into that. Like, breaking even for a lot of these butchers will be fine because they all still get paid and they all still live and they can all still buy stock. So they don't care as much about massive profit margins. They have no shareholders to please in this regard. Okay, let's talk about the characterization of farmers, because they try to tell you that they are massive evil corporations control these, but I just think that characterization is untrue. Go to North Queensland. Most farmers who farm things like sugarcane and corn and stuff like that are just small family businesses. These businesses have been passed down for a long time, and they bought up massive chunks of land. So you will often see large areas of farms controlled by only a small handful of people. But even in the case where they do have corporate conglomerates controlling these farms, the farmers themselves are still families. They are still vulnerable to a lot of the things that we talk about in our world as well, and I do not think they can erase the harm that we talk about here. Okay, then on competition, Rob tells you that this is a price race to the bottom between Coles and Woolworths, but I think this is untrue. Look at the status quo. Look at the fact that if you go to Coles has the down special, in which this thing is still seemingly lower than Woolworths, but what you don't realize is that that cost item is still 10 times more expensive than it was 5 years ago, and ridiculous, not 10 times, but it's still significantly more expensive than it was years ago, because Coles and Woolworths have an incentive to mutually work together. They can the overall trend of prices can keep going up, profit margins can keep going up, and they'll occasionally lower it for weekly specials and stuff like that, but still on the graph of cost, it is still exponentially growing more and more and more between the two of them. And that is why it is comparatively unique to our world. You have sheer diversity, the sheer level of diversification means that these businesses actually have so many other competing parties that may have other business strategies, and some of those strategies will likely to be to reduce prices, because in our world the metric of cost becomes far better prioritized at the point in which you are likely to have the incentive to pass on cost cutting and stuff like that to consumers, and to not operate at absurd profit margins because you are incentivized by pleasing shareholders and pleasing corporate conglomerates. Okay, what else? They tell you that these corporations get criticized, which is why this is happening. But note, as I've said, they're getting criticized under the status quo, but the prices are still fucked. This doesn't actually have an impact. And Jemma tells you, and let's expand upon that these corporations, Coles and Woolies, literally can donate and lobby to the government. The Nationals are not that good at protecting farmers. In fact, they fucking suck at protecting farmers, because Coles and Woolies can donate to the National Party and the LNP, they're in the coalition, in New South Wales, to reduce the amount of regulation that the government enacts here. They tell you that the government can enact regulation in the sense of blockading foreign businesses, but I don't understand why so much of what they talk about here is exclusive. You can still regulate protections for small businesses. That is not impossible in the realm of regulation here. Okay, then they tell you economies of scale at first, but I think ultimately they do not mechanize where economies of scale are passed on to the regular consumers. These corporations are not prancing around happy rainbow unicorns, we love the consumers, we want to reduce their prices. They have profit margins. Like, they want to please shareholders, as I've said continuously, and at the point at which that is true, that overrides the incentive to pass on to consumers, because they do not respond to the analysis we give you about how people are so dependent on these chains because of a regretful amount of market domination that they've had. If we didn't have that domination in the first place, people would be less dependent on Coles and Woolworths, and they would do things like shopping around. And I do not think that they can then prove that they get any benefit here, because at the point at which you have diversification and more agency over where you can shop around, I think one, families are better able to go and like choose competitors in a bigger arena of more people. Therefore, pricing becomes far more important for small businesses. So not only are they not incentivized to make massive profit margins to please shareholders, but they're likely to be actively monitoring prices in the area and try to beat each other. And there's so much diversification that it's really hard for them to all to work together to try to mutually increase prices. Because it would just be so hard to coordinate between dozens and dozens of different butcher businesses across like Melbourne or Brisbane, for example. So I think at the end of the speech, note that in their world, they perplexingly defend the status quo and claim that it is somehow good price-wise, despite the fact that when a single mum walks into Coles and Woolworths now, they're getting fucked over 10 times more than they were 5 years ago, and it's because they have profit incentives, and in the comparative, when they have far more diversification and choice, their lives are going to be so much cheaper and so much better. Proud to propose.
Thank you. I've used it before this weekend.
Thank you very much to second and negative for those kind remarks. I now invite the Director to conclude the case for the affirmative bench. Here.
Firstly, I'll ask if we're better for consumers. The answer is yes. And the second is, do we get better outcomes for farmers? Can we do? Let's start with what's better for consumers. Because at Matthew, we explain the ways in which large chains are beneficial for consumers in terms of price, in terms of quality, in terms of accountability and regulation. How does this negative team respond? The first response is to say that big supermarkets might be able to operate cheaply, but they don't pass on these cost-cutting measures to the consumer, which misunderstands our argument. It's not that they are altruistic, but the competition between actors who are able to operate at economies of scale means that they must make goods cheaper. Obviously, they aren't altruistic, but the comparative is Coles, who is able to sell goods for $2, competing against small businesses who maybe can only sell goods for $5. Because there is a difference in the ability of different corporations to operate at the same price, there is no kind of successful competition. It is only the rise of big supermarkets which forces the kind of naturalistic competition which we get. The better iteration of their argument is that big supermarkets will work together to price gouge. A number of reasons this argument falls apart. Firstly, it is uncontemplative of the preemptive material we give at first, which is firstly that there is a massive amount of public backlash and that public perception is a powerful mechanism for regulation. Post Four Corners, there has been a decrease in the prices of goods in supermarkets. Owen's response and the last attempt to revive this argument is like, but things are more expensive now than ever. Yeah, but that is not a result of big supermarkets. It's a result of things like massive shocks to supply chains caused by things like COVID, caused by things like natural disasters. That has absolutely no impact on this debate. And in fact, it is far, far worse under their world because these supply chain issues hurt small businesses far, far more because they cannot kind of deal with the shock of cost. But secondly, even if public backlash doesn't work, the obvious intuition is that governmental regulation will. Obviously, it is incredibly politically divisive and unpopular. If your people cannot afford groceries, governments will not be elected or re-elected if this is a policy that they kind of put their hands back on. But finally, and I think this is most importantly, the reason price gouging is unlikely to work is because with a world with big supermarkets, there is always the threat of defection. Coles or Woolworths could decrease prices immediately and then capture the entire market. And that is the reason why price gouging doesn't work in private markets, because there is always the threat that one member will capture every single consumer by lowering their prices immediately, which is just kind of a reason why price gouging doesn't make sense under capitalism. Compare the sophistication of these mechanisms and this argument to Owen's, but just look at the prices. Sure, big prices are expensive, but we actually recognize why it's unlikely to be worse under our side. The next claim is, it's good to give people choice and allow them to shop around. And the question I have is, why? Like, why do you have a right to choose where you get your meat from? I'm not convinced that this is a real right, but even if it is, I'm not sure why it needs to be actualized in the way that this negative team say it is. Butchers do exist under our side, but also you can buy meat in different supermarkets. I'm so unclear why you have a choice to shop around. But secondly, it is far, far worse under their side. And the reason for that is they misunderstand how small businesses work. It doesn't make sense for 4 butcher shops to open up in a certain community because their profit margins are incredibly small, and you cannot capture a market and survive if there are already a number of businesses in that area. So they don't get choice under their side, but they just get like 1 or maybe 2 butchers. That doesn't seem good to me in a world, or at least in our world, we have that butcher, but also a number of competing big supermarkets. I think their big push is small businesses are better. Firstly, because they price match to their community. 2 responses. Firstly, why? Like, they assume that small businesses are altruistic, but give no reason for you to believe that. I think the far more likely characterization is that they are a business, they want to stay alive, they are profit-oriented. And so if it is true that big supermarkets are profit-oriented and price gouge, I do not understand why small businesses who are also profit-oriented wouldn't price gouge. The difference in this debate is that government's able to hold massive chains accountable because there is massive public backlash, but a Labour government doesn't go into Ipswich and then yell at a single butcher for doing something bad, so that community is forced to pay more for their meat. Under our world, we are kind of able to counteract the profit orientation. But secondly, even if small businesses are altruistic, even if they want to do what's best for their community, they can't price match or make goods cheap or affordable to the same extent because the market is more unstable. Often income streams are far more speculative and volatile. They can't operate as cheaply. Owen's typical response is that they can still buy in bulk, which is so uncomparative. We're talking about Woolworths buying 500,000 cans or units of something versus a small business maybe buying 5,000. Obviously, there is a massive difference there in the kinds of bulk or the kinds of economies of scale that you're able to operate in. Their next claim is, well, it's good for the community and it's good for a tradition of butchers to be able to kind of operate as butchers. Reality check, these businesses already exist. But second, obviously, your tradition to exist in a kind of family dynasty of butchers is less important than everyone's ability and right to access free food. The final thing, the nail in the coffin for their small businesses argument, is just that if you look around in the world, there is a revealed preference for people not to go to small businesses because we live in a cost of living crisis where people cannot afford most things, so they have a preference to go to big chains. And I think this negative team is incredibly patronizing. I think that argument is like, well, people should just support small businesses and give up that kind of quality of life and ability to pay rent. I think that is an incredibly unfair argument and an incredibly unfair burden to place on consumers. So, that should prove to you that we can make goods more cheap, more high quality for consumers. And so all I'm going to do for the rest of this issue is explain why they are the most important. There are 3 reasons. Firstly, they're the most important on scale. In Australia, there are, what, like 24 million people, and every single person is relying on supermarkets. Every single person is relying on food. If we can make goods cheaper for all of them, their quality of life increases, their ability to have more money increases. That is massively important. But secondly, on vulnerability, companies like Woolworths and Coles subsidize the operation of stores in low socioeconomic areas because they want to capture the land, even if it is a bleeding asset. That means that the poorest individuals under our side are catered for, are able to afford food to put on the table for their families, even if you don't care about scale. The most vulnerable and the poorest people in society are captured under our side. The small businesses may try to help them under side negative, but they cannot because they cannot operate in the same way. Finally, and this is, I think, an entirely independent path to victory, but I'm going to flip that argument about environmental benefits. Because our claim is that when you can operate at economies of scale, i.e. have bigger trucks, have bigger shipments, you cut down a massive amount of emissions because you don't have to do much of the back and forth. Which means, I think, like 35% of global emissions comes from agriculture, and 15% of that comes from movement, which means we have a massive reduction in the amount of emissions which exist. So if you believe that this debate is a stalemate on consumers, or that farmers, or that individuals are kind of equivalent under both sides, we win on the environmental consideration. We make things better for consumers, we win this debate. But we win it a second time over by proving that it is better for farmers. Let's move through each of their claims. Their first claim is big farmers, or farmers in general, get fucked over by supermarkets in negotiations, which firstly ignores the context of this debate, which is that most farmers are in ridiculously powerful co-ops. NEC operates in this like 1840 world, the ye-old farmer going to the market with their like bag of goods over their shoulder. That is not the context we live in. We live in a globalized world where the way you make money is by making things in bulk and by accepting investment. The negative team's response is like, nah, you go to North Queensland and they're all family owned. But being family owned doesn't mean that you're vulnerable. Often these like family farms in North Queensland are like massive and are owned by people who have hundreds of millions of dollars. But even if they're not in co-ops, even if they are individual families, that's fine. Firstly, because they have a massive amount of governmental lobbying power. The nationals who like to be elected have to kind of listen to farmers because these are the people who vote for them. But secondly, they're able to protest. The success in France and the recent image of tractors rolling past Westminster Abbey proves that people care if farmers are being fucked over. Of course there are small farmers in this debate, but you should believe that the change to them is not done by big supermarkets. And the reason for that is that they only sell locally in their rural communities, and Coles doesn't set up big supermarkets in those rural communities because it's not profitable. So these individuals are unchanged by this debate. Their second claim is like Coles and Woolworths will import foreign goods. The obvious response to this is that we can enact protectionist policies, and the government does already, because they want to make sure that farmers are looked after. So we prove that constant demand for farmers and the fact that they can sell goods in bulk is far better for them. We win this debate.
Thank you to third voting for those 5 remarks. I now invite the third negative to conclude the case for the negative team and in fact today's debate. Here.
Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The most important thing to prove in this debate is that our side of the world gets the most affordability, the most food on the table for the most amount of people. Affirmative tries to claim to you that you're going to naturally get more consumer availability or more consumer accessibility under their side of the house. This fundamentally misunderstands the way in which these large conglomerate, these large supermarkets naturally operate. They naturally have profit incentives. They have shareholders that they are beholden to. They need to increase their profit margins year after year after year. When Yani comes up and tells you that they're raising their prices because there's supply chain issues, that doesn't explain the fact that Coles and Woolies both had record profits over the past couple of years. It is very clear that now that Coles and Woolies have domination over the market, which we have told you, they've driven out any local business that is able to compete with them. They are able to indefinitely raise their prices. Why? Because people will always need food. Even if they have to spend 60, 70, 80% of their paycheck on that food, they will always buy food. Coles and Woolies are able to raise their prices indefinitely. They have incentives to work together to make sure that they are both getting record profits because they are at the top of the market. They have formed a duopoly. They do not have any substantial competition, which Av has conceded to. They are able to have complete and utter control over the food market. Even if, under their side of the world, because of the economies of scale, they are able to make, the floor of the cost of food lower, the ceiling, we tell you, is substantially higher in their side of the world. The ceiling is far, far higher. They are able to raise these prices to a much higher degree. We get more, so they tell you that these supermarkets are likely to have much more accountability than local shops because, you can't have the government looking in on every single local shop. We tell you that under our world, you get a far more diversity of local shops popping up because they simply are being priced out constantly by these massive supermarkets. You are going to have more diversity. You are going to have more competition naturally. If a local butcher decides to increase their prices by an exorbitant amount, people will just go to the one in the next suburb and they will be priced out. You have more accountability by the consumer, and you're putting far more power into the hands of the consumer to hold these businesses accountable, making sure they're not making record profits. Frankly, these big corporations are always going to have far too much power for the consumer to have any sway or control over how they are likely to operate, how they are likely to price. Even if these economies of scale do make it cheaper for these businesses to operate, we have seen in the past couple of years that they have no incentive to pass these benefits onto the consumer. They do not care about whether the consumer is getting the best possible deal. They only care that they are able to increase their profit margins as much as possible. Local businesses are easy to hold accountable. Okay, cool. So I think the most important thing to prove in this debate is who gets the most consumer affordability. We are willing to take on the loss of consumers maybe having to spend a couple more hours a week going to different stores if it means they are able to put food on the table because they're not spending 60% of their paycheck on a meal, because Coles and Woolies have been able to dominate the market in such a way that they're able to drive out every single local business and then go in and raise their prices exorbitantly for years and years to come, right? The reason that they have this market hold that they do at the moment is because maybe at some point they were able to be cheaper, more convenient, and they were able to like completely dominate the market, price out all other local shops, and now everyone goes to Coles and Woolies because it's what they do, and there's no alternatives anymore. So that means they're in a position where they're able to like rise prices indefinitely. On the point of like rural communities that don't have any other options, the reason they don't have any other options is because a Woolworths came and outcompeted every other local business. They are no longer able to. On top of this, Coles and Woolies often increase the prices in rural communities. They're not willing to take a profit loss. They set their prices higher when it comes to rural communities. They say it's like transport costs. Even if you are close to the farm, they say distribution costs are higher. We need to make the prices higher for these rural communities. Sorry that you're paying the majority for a paycheck for this food. This is your only option. Sucks to be you, right? Whereas we provide a world for you where local businesses are able to appear, where they're able to compete in a healthy market. They're not being completely priced out by these massive corporations, and they're able to actually compete, make sure that people are paying reasonable prices for food, that their prices aren't being increased forever and ever. You're actually going to see a world where consumers are better able to hold these shops accountable. And also, like on the point of like accessibility and the ability to have like halal food, like vegan food, these local shops and like butcheries, grocers, whatever, they are going to adapt to the needs of those in the community. It is inconceivable that a butcher in a Muslim community would not serve halal meat. Like, I think simply it's just intuitive that if people do have a desire to buy these foods, then these local grocers will adapt. When you take away the massive competition of Coles and Woolies, you give them more capacity to adapt. You give them more capacity to fill these holes in the market. We tell you in a world where Coles and Woolies never existed, these holes in the market will have been filled. There is going to be far more diversity. There's going to be far more market competition among these smaller shops. It's better for the consumer. It's better for the retailer. It's better for the farmers. Okay, let's go on to this point about the farmers. So they tell us that a lot of these farmers are massive conglomerates, and that Coles and Woolies are the only people who can possibly like contend with them. They're the only people who can negotiate with them, because otherwise their prices will be like increasing exorbitantly. Right, okay, so we come along and tell you that the reason that a lot of these conglomerates are necessary for smaller farmers is because Coles and Woolies have such a large market share, and they would have zero bargaining power unless they joined like a massive farming conglomerate. In a lot of cases, a lot of these farmers are being ripped off twofold. They're being ripped off by the conglomerate that they're part of, and they're also being ripped off by the supermarkets, but there is no other way to operate under the status quo, so they are forced into the position where they had to. It is much more preferential that the farmers would be able to negotiate with local shops on their own terms, so they would be able to get a fair and reasonable price. We tell you that like Coles and Woolies have this bargaining power because they're like, well, if the local Australian farmers are not willing to sell to us for like super low prices, we can just import from overseas, from places like South America, where they the cost of like doing agriculture is far lower, and also they are willing to take like far lower salaries because cost of living is lower. This prices out like the Australian farmers or forces them to sell like at extremely low prices. This is our like environmental benefit as well as like a loss to farmers. They tell us that governments can just come in and hold them accountable. Where is this government accountability under status quo? We tell you that governments actually have a large incentive to make sure that Coles and Woolies are doing well, because they are like large GDP leaders in Australia, right? They make our economy look really, really good, and also they have a large amount of power. They have a large lobbying power. They have far more power than the local farmers do, even if they are part of conglomerates. Coles and Woolies made up like a far larger proportion of like Australian market share than a lot of these farming companies do. They simply have more financial power, more lobbying power, more leveraging power than any of these companies do. Even if they do come in and like have a CEO that steps down, that doesn't change like the incentives of Woolworths as a company. The board of directors is the same. They are always going to have the unique incentive of trying to make as much money as they humanly can, and they will into the future. The difference is these local is like in a world where you have far more diversity of local corporations, these are not going to have the capacity to raise prices indefinitely, because there's always going to be more competition. You're always going to get better outcomes for the consumer, and you're not going to have people starving because they can't afford food. Thank you.
Alright, thanks everyone for the debate. If you would cross the floor, shake hands, step outside, I'll call you when the OA is ready. feel like I'm a news reader. Alright, thank you everyone for what I thought was a good debate. It was pretty comfortably above average for an Easter standard. Congratulations, nice work to everyone. I'm going to skip general feedback because I don't really believe in it. If you want team feedback, personal feedback, please come and see me after the debate. Result, reasons for result. In a relatively close but clear decision, I awarded this debate to the affirmative team. Congratulations, commiserations as appropriate. I think there is functionally one question which is determinative in this debate, and that is how does this rise of large supermarket chains impact on consumers? But I'm going to start somewhat unintuitively with the impacts on farmers first, because I believe that some of the analysis that we are given by teams in farmers actually some of the consumer material is contingent on what we hear about farmers in this debate. So, what are we told constructively about farmers from side affirmative? We're told that they have a significant degree of bargaining power, that they are lobbying like they're going to be in France, like they do in France. They are very highly subsidised, that they're able to contract more meaningfully with these corporations, and that they get more consistency in their supply chain. So you know that these large corporations are going to continue to buy from them. Conversely, from side negative, we hear that these are small businesses who feel as there are no other option. They get more negotiating power with local grocers, and that they need to stop. This stops the need to compete internationally. Where I fall on this question is basically that both of these things can be true at once, because there are sets of farmers that are large cooperatives with massive bargaining power, and there are sets of farmers who are local and compete locally. The reason then I think that has an impact on this debate is because these large farming conglomerates are the ones who are more likely to engage, because of their large scale, with large supermarkets and corporations, comparative to smaller farmers who are more likely going to need to contract with small businesses. So I agree that it's perhaps more difficult for small farmers in this world. But the negative analysis that they give us, that this means that farmers have more negotiating power with local grocers, becomes influential in the question of how prices change for small businesses. Because when you increase the bargaining power of those small grocers, you don't necessarily have to accept that there is some risk of an increased cost there as well. So that brings us on to the question of how this affects consumers. And I think there is one question which teams focus on primarily, and that is the question of cost. And secondly then, a series of less important questions about the access to goods and a series of associated benefits that each of these types of supermarkets can provide. Constructively, side affirmative tells us that this will decrease prices, and they have four main reasons to explain this. Firstly is that you get economies of scale. You can buy things in bulk, you can have massive warehouses, you can negotiate with large-scale organisations. Secondly, that there is competition between the two supermarkets to keep their prices fairly similar, so you have the incentive to reduce your prices. Next, we are told that they can subsidise stores in lower socioeconomic areas, and finally we're told that they are more accountable. Comparatively, side negative tells us that prices are likely to increase in this world with the rise of these supermarket chains, because there is price gouging in status quo, people have to go here, they lack other options. It's very easy to expand, to buy out these competitors, and people will shop around. So, how then do these claims interact? I'm going to start with the direct responses each team give these claims, then probably what stands constructively at the end of that and how they weigh up. So, side negative makes a few responses to side affirmative directly, sort of mechanistically. Firstly is to say that small businesses can also buy in bulk. I believe this is mitigatory to a small extent, that small businesses probably can buy in some bulk, but I believe that side affirmative is able to claim a larger scale on which they can buy goods. Similarly, we are told that the competition mechanism becomes ineffective because these corporations have an incentive to level their prices very close to one another. I think this is an effective response, and the response we get from side affirmative is that one can just drop their prices and catch the whole market. I think this response mitigates the damage done by side negative, but doesn't constructively demonstrate that they are always going to sort of not price gouge, because I believe that the incentive also exists. If you both keep your prices really high, the amount you would have to drop to make it meaningful is a significant enough drop in your profits that you wouldn't have any interest in doing it. So if there were always going to be these two corporations, I can see why, as side negative explains, there is that risk that they are always going to function sort of in a cartel-like fashion. Similarly, side affirmative makes a series of responses to side negative, telling us that you don't necessarily have the capacity to expand in the same ways that this, and you don't have the capacity to drop these prices. I think these are reasonably effective responses. So what do I believe what two questions remain then for me after this clash is, does this become cheaper? And to answer, I think, first to us, is regulation on large corporations going to be effective? Because side affirmative explains the reason that the price gouging is not going to be as significant as they say, because there is a good set of regulation which is going to be engaged with by governments to prevent costs from spiralling massively. We're given functionally three regulatory mechanisms. The first is that there's going to be significant public pressure, things like exposés in the news, people don't like paying this sort of cost, people turn against these supermarkets. Secondly, we're told that there is a significant amount of government influence, and finally there's the risk of defection if prices get too high and the other company is able to keep them low. Comparatively, side negative tells us that the regulation will be ineffective for, again, three reasons. First is that there's just no alternative, so it was unclear what the other option was. Secondly, was that there was a significant amount of corporate capture over the government, that regulation was likely to be ineffective because of donations and lobbying. And finally, that these corporations have significant structural power in the sort of Australian economy, which makes regulating them difficult. I tend to believe that the side negative analysis is perhaps slightly more true in this case, that regulation is going to be significantly difficult. And I believe side affirmative provides a series of reasons that regulation could work, and I believe that regulation works to an extent to limit the absolute worst excesses, but it was unclear to me that this regulation was ever going to be sufficient to be equivalent to these corporations being altruistic. So I don't think that side affirmative is able to prove that regulation is always going to be good. I think they're able to prove that it is going to mitigate the worst harm. But the comparative I have to compare that to is whether I believe these costs, the cost benefit they get means that they can reduce the price sufficiently so that even with some degree of price gouging, they are always going to be cheaper on net than your local corporation. Because I believe the analysis from side negative that lots of small businesses are more competitive. What I don't think side negative sufficiently proves in this debate is that that competition doesn't bottom out. And what I mean by that is, side affirmative demonstrates sufficiently to me that there is a set of costs which small businesses can't afford to avoid, that they necessarily have to increase their prices to be profitable. And I think the intuition here that works effectively in this debate is, if this competition was so effective in status quo, why is there not a massive proliferation of small businesses right now? And I think the answer to that is, even if they can be better, more altruistic, and I tend to believe side affirmative analysis, they're not necessarily altruistic, given market capture by small business, they will probably price gouge. But even if I don't believe that, I didn't believe they had the set of resources available to reduce prices sufficiently. And that if they did, they would necessarily be out-competing these large supermarkets in a lot of contexts already. So, I believe then at the end of that even if large supermarkets were going to be reasonably bad actors, and I believe they are, but it is sufficiently mitigated that the prices on net, on side affirmative, will be lower than the prices on side negative if you are going to small shops compared to large chains. So even though I believe there are a series of harms, and it is not a perfect competition, I believe it is the mechanism by which they are able to subsidise and make these goods affordable is just comparatively much more considerable than the mechanism that small businesses have. And I think that where the competition mechanism on affirmative does become relevant is to explain why these goods are never going to become more expensive than small businesses. Because for the series of reasons that side negative provides that small businesses are more sympathetic and more enjoyable, I believe people will go to small businesses if the price is comparable. So I think there's always that incentive and the capacity on side affirmative to make the prices lower than small businesses could. Finally then, a series of questions on the accessibility of these, and side affirmative tells us that it's good because they will stock a variety of options like halal food, vegan food, gluten-free food. I believe the negative analysis that your local butcher in communities where this is particularly relevant will stock this. Similar to the cost stuff above, I believe that you could probably stock this slightly cheaper at large scales. So there's probably a small benefit to people who need those goods, but I don't think it was a runaway win. Secondly, we're told that there are a series of extra things from side affirmative, like personal shoppers and delivery. I believe that these things were good, but probably applied largely because there were additional costs to a section of the population who was not the most vulnerable. So the benefit of that is it exists, but is not massive. We're then told from side affirmative that these corporations have two things. Sorry, that they are more shock resistant to exogenous shocks in the economy, and this is under-mechanised but has potential. The next and final claim then is that these do a lot of like good in the community, like the Woolworths Cricket Blast, Coles providing goods for schools and things like that. Comparatively, side negative also tells us that these donations, there's like local businesses donate to the community, give back to the community. I believe that both of these things are true. I believe both have an incentive to ingratiate themselves to the community to a degree. So I believe that perhaps there was slightly more capacity of large supermarkets to do large-scale programs like this, but that was not to say that we only got community support from large-scale supermarkets. So ultimately, I found that side affirmative was better able to reduce the cost of goods, and most of the analysis in this debate was contingent on proving that, which is why I wanted to make the side negative. But congratulations to both teams. I thought this was a really good and enjoyable debate.
Thanks, Xavier.
No worries.
Thanks very much.
There you go.
We should start, go upstairs, wait for a few more people, and maybe head to lunch.
Where are we going for lunch today?
That's a great question.
We went to Nando's yesterday.